Hi there, and welcome to God Speaks Today. My name is Andy Croft, and I work for a church in Watford called Soul Survivor. And today we're going to be talking about daily dependence. You may have noticed, but relationships are not static things. We can sometimes think of them as something like a rock, and it just sits there and it stays there, but that's not how they are. They're living things. They evolve and they develop, and what that means is that they can kind of wither and fade, or they can flourish and mature. And you'll see this in your own human relationships. When I look back at my relationship with my wife over the years, I see that there's definitely been a flourishing and a maturing. And often you can point to particular moments or particular stories in a relationship where you grew to love the other person or trust the other person in different ways. And it's certainly been a learning experience getting to know my wife. I remember there was a time when she always used to call me a little piggy because of the amount of food that I would eat whenever we went anywhere. And I remember a time I took her for a picnic, and I got all the food out of the picnic basket and I put it on the blanket there. And I remember her looking at it and saying, "Oh, is this all the food there is?" And I turned to her and I said, "Yes, it is, you little piggy." And at that moment, I discovered that whilst it's okay for Beth to call me a little piggy, it is not okay for me to call Beth a little piggy. And it was a case of note to self: do not call Beth a little piggy in the future. Another story was I took her out for our first day. I took her to Shakeaway for a milkshake because I know how to treat a lady. And it got to the point where we were paying, and I was like, "No, I'm going to pay," because that's what you do on a date, isn't it? I insist, I will pay. And she said, "No, I'm going to pay." And we had this big argument about who was going to pay for it. And I said to her, "Beth, look, there's 10 quid here. I will leave this £10 on the table if you don't, I'm just going to leave it here. So at the end of the day, just let me pay." And Beth refused. She went and paid. And then I had to leave 10 quid on the table. And I was a student. I had no money. And it absolutely killed me leaving that 10 quid there. But there was something about the fact that we just went toe to toe that called me weird. But I loved that. I loved it that we were arguing like that. There was another time, Beth, I lent her my jumper, and she gave it back to me after wearing it for a day or so. And I remember for the next 2 or 3 weeks, it just smelled amazing. It smelled of her perfume in this amazing way. And she confessed, although she denied, any knowledge at the time, but she confessed months later that she'd actually, before she gave the jumper back to me, she'd taken it and she had poured half a bottle of her perfume all over this jumper. And so at the time, I thought, "Oh, I'm charming Beth, I'm kind of wooing her." And I look back now and I see that I was this innocent little fly buzzing along, and she was there spinning her seductive web of lies and kind of drawing me in. But over the years, there have been things like that with the two of us, and we've grown to know and to love one another in a deeper way. And the key really to intimacy in any relationship is not actually physical touch, although that can be a part of it. It's trust. The key is trust. You may be familiar with the great theologian Rihanna, who has a song that came out a couple of years ago, and it says, "In this California king bed, we're 10,000 miles apart." And what she's saying there is we're lying in this bed, albeit a big one, next to each other, and even though we're in bed together, we're 10,000 miles away from each other. You know that you can be physically right next to someone, but if you don't trust them, there's no intimacy. And in the same way, you can be on the other side of the world from someone, but if you utterly trust them with all of your heart, there's a closeness there. The key to intimacy in relationship is trust. And trust is formed with God as we learn to depend on Him daily. And so I want to suggest a prayer that we should be praying probably more frequently than we are. And it's a line from the Lord's Prayer. We should pray the whole of the Lord's Prayer, but I just want to particularly highlight one line to us. And it's from Matthew chapter 6, verse 11. Here it is. "Give us today our daily bread." If we learn to pray that prayer regularly, our relationship with God will flourish and mature. Our intimacy with God will grow, because what it's a prayer for is daily provision. It's about trusting Him for the everyday. So let's unpack it a little bit. What does it mean when it says bread? First of all, the bread means bread for the body. So it's physically, what do we need for living? We need a job, we need a house, we need healthcare. It's all that basic stuff of life. Also, the bread means spiritual things. It's God providing meaning for us and joy and purpose and sustenance for our souls. So when we come to God and we say, "Give us today our daily bread," we're saying, "Give me all that I need to sustain me as a human being." That's what we're praying. The thing to note about it is it says here, give us today our daily bread. So the word day comes twice. And we see a little picture of the way that God loves to provide for us with the Israelites back in Exodus chapter 16. And in Exodus 16, they've been rescued. They were slaves in Egypt. God saved them through Moses and the plagues, and they're out there in the desert. And after a little while, they begin to moan. And the first thing they're complaining about is, we're in the desert, there's no water here. And so God provides water for them. And you can read the story, but there's a lot of Israelites. When I first read it, I thought it was just a trickle of Evian coming out from a pebble or something. But there's well over 1 million Israelites. So this is an absolute flood of San Pellegrino pouring out at the side of the mountain. He provides water for them. And the next thing they want is they want food. And so they start to grumble and complain that there's no food. And it says, Exodus chapter 16, verse 4, God said, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. So every day he provides manna that comes from heaven, and they come out of their tents in the morning and the whole of the desert looks like a Krispy Kreme. That's how it's described. It's like icing all over. There's all frosty bits. And they go and they gather the manna, and every day they have to go out and do that. And the way that it works is the manna is plentiful. There's more than enough for them, but it only lasts a single day. There's enough, but it only lasts a single day. Why? You ever wondered that when you read that passage? Why would God do that? Why not, get some tips from Mary Berry or somebody? Why not figure out how to make new, longer lasting manna so that you don't have to bake it up in heaven every day, so that the Israelites don't have to go out and collect it every day? Why not seeded batch manna, something that's going to have some longevity to it? Why does he do it like that? My theory is that God is trying to teach the Israelites about relationship with him. And what he's trying to teach them is to trust him, he's trying to teach them to trust him not for a lifetime, not for a year, not for a month, not for a week, but for a single day. They'd already seen the spectacular. I mean, they'd seen Egypt covered in frogs and locusts, and the Nile turned to blood and the sun blotted out. They'd seen the sea part, and they'd seen a pillar of cloud lead them by day and a pillar of burning fire lead them at the night. So they've seen the spectacular. And what he's trying to train them to do, and he's trying to train you and I to do this as well, is to trust him for the ordinary, for the everyday needs that we have. Yes, to trust him for the great miracles that we need sometimes, but also to trust him for those ordinary, everyday miracles that he'd provide, not as a one-off thing, but every single day. Last year, our first baby was born, and we've called him Josiah. And one of the things we found out, I mean, I probably should have known this, but we found out when Josiah was born that he likes milk. And not only does he like milk, but he wants milk all the time. So Josiah, when he was just born, I almost said when he was just fresh, but that sounds like he's, anyway, let's not go there. But when he was just born, he wanted milk. Every 2 or 3 hours he'd be crying, and so we'd have to feed him milk. And I have thought at various times, like 2 or 3 or 4 in the morning, like, God, why didn't you invent babies with camel's humps? Have you ever wondered that? I have wondered that in the early hours. I was very tired. But it's like, why doesn't he make Josiah with a camel's hump? Yes, it would have been more painful for Beth to give birth to him, but hey, that's not my problem. I didn't have to give birth. Oh, I can almost feel the reaction through the TV. Hello, darling. But Josiah, why not give him this camel's hump? Because if he's got a camel's hump, then what could happen is, you feed him the milk and it just goes into this hump, and then for the next 3 months, you don't need to worry about it. And he's got milk to feed him. We could put him down in his room. We could go off on holiday. We could come back. He'd still be fine. Why not do it like that? What God has done with babies is he's designed them so that every 2 to 3 hours, they have to come close to their mother. And when they come close, yes, they come close for milk, and yes, the milk obviously matters. But there's a bond that's formed between the baby and the child. I think that's what he's doing with the Israelites too. He's designed the manna so that every day they need to draw near to him again. Every day they have to come close again and discover again that he's a faithful father who provides for his children. It's not so much about the bread, it's about the bond that's being formed. And when Jesus teaches us to pray this prayer, give us today our daily bread, he's trying to help us understand that what we're invited into is this glorious, wonderful adventure of depending on God. That's the sort of relationship that we're to have. Often when we think of a relationship maturing, the way that I've thought about it is I think, yeah, you grow up from being a kid and you become more independent, don't you? You become, you eventually you get your own income and you get your own house, hopefully, and you move away. But the relationship with God, it actually works the other way around. It's not about becoming more independent. It's about becoming more dependent. Sometimes we treat our relationship with God like a wind-up toy that you get in a Happy Meal or something. And we think we come to him and he winds us up, he fills us up for on Sunday or something, and then off we go for the rest of the week with that energy inside. But that's not the picture in the Bible. The picture is this daily closeness. And so don't think of it as like God winds us up and sends us off. Think of it like we help father and child, hand in hand, walking through life together. That's what we're invited into. As we think about what that might look like in practice, I just want to share some stories. First of all, about physical provision. God provides us physically with our daily bread. Since I've come to know him, I have found him to be unbelievably faithful in this regard. A couple of stories, I could tell you lots, but one is it's just a simple thing. I remember Beth and I were trying to save up money so that we could give something away. So we were a bit tight financially. And it got to the point towards the end of the month where we just had £10 left in our bank account. And we were going to be fine because we had food in the house and stuff in the freezer, so we weren't worried. But a friend of mine then came up to me and said, "Oh, Andy, would you mind if you gave me a lift home after a Bible study group?" So I said, sure. So I got in the car and I realised we didn't have any petrol, and he lived a little way away. So we drove to the petrol station. I thought, I'll just put £10, our last £10 of petrol in the car, and we'll be okay. So I filled it up with £10 and we walked into the petrol station to pay. And just at that point, a guy coincidentally from our church happened to arrive at the petrol station at the same time, and he came in and he just looked a bit surprised. He said, "Andy, God's just told me that I'm to pay for your petrol." At which point, if I'm honest, I wish I put 65 quid in the car, but I hadn't. And I said to him, "Oh, that's amazing. Well, as it happens, it's only £10, but thank you so much." And he went up and he paid for it. And that's never happened to me before, and it's never happened to me since. But what it felt like in that moment is, God, you didn't need to do that. We had food and we were okay, but he seized an opportunity, and it was his way of saying, just in that simple little way, "Andy, I'm here for you. I've got your back. I'll provide for you." Another story that's from a couple of years ago, I went to India, and I remember getting on this plane, and a friend of mine I was a student, I had no money. A friend of mine had bought my ticket with his air miles, and because he flies everywhere, he had loads of air miles, and he would never do this for himself, but for me, he paid for me to go business class. So I'm sitting in business class on this plane. I've never been in business class in my life, and I'm thinking, I do not belong here. I was like so scruffy. I had a t-shirt that I liked, but had a giant hole in the shoulder and ripped in my jeans. And I had this, and not because they were cool, but because they were old. And I had this scruffy bag sitting next to me, and I'm just sort of sitting there with all these people in their suits. And I remember a flight attendant came up to me and said, "Oh, excuse me, do you mind if I have a word with you?" So we got up and we went to the side, and he just said, "Do you mind me asking how you paid for your ticket?" And I remember just thinking, oh my word, he's gonna send me, back to economy. Like, he obviously doesn't think I should belong here. And so I just said, a friend of mine paid for it with his air miles. I was thinking, are you even allowed to ask me that question? And then he said, "Oh, okay." And he said, "Well, listen, there's a guy who's up in first, which is like the level up. This was the upstairs of the plane. There's a guy up in first who wants to swap with somebody in business. Would you be willing to swap with him?" And I said, "Yes, I would." So I went and got my scruffy bag, and I went upstairs, and I was sitting there in first class on a plane. And I remember having this whole dilemma because I had a flat bed, and I was thinking, do I stay awake and enjoy all this amazing food and I have a giant TV, or do I fall asleep because I have a flat bed? And I think in the end I just ate as much as I could and then fell asleep because I couldn't help it and woke up in India. But as I look back at that, actually, I was feeling incredibly vulnerable at that point. I was 19 years old. I was going off to a country where I didn't know anyone. I was going to be there for a month. I was scared. I was frightened, and I was alone. And as I sat up there in first, the honest truth is, it wasn't the TV and it wasn't the food. It was just a sense of closeness with God. Jesus calls himself the bread of life. And what it was is I just felt like just for me in that moment, it was his way of saying, I'm here, Andy, I've got you, I've got your back. And I want to be really clear, what I'm not saying is that from God we should expect promotions and fast cars and giant houses. Jesus lives a life where he has nothing. The early church, it's much more about them giving away their material possessions than it is about them collecting them. I've never been upgraded since. Plenty of people who aren't Christians get upgraded all the time. But just for me, in that particular moment, it was daily provision that said, not only am I giving you bread, but I am bread. I am the bread. There was an intimacy that was formed. Do you understand what I'm saying? It wasn't about the bread, it was about the bond. Let me read you a verse. This is from James chapter 1, verse 17. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like the shifting shadows. Learning to trust him as a father who doesn't change, who provides for us, is key to depending on him. One person I look to for inspiration in this stuff is a guy called Hudson Taylor. And Hudson Taylor was around in the 1800s. He went off as a missionary to China. And lots of what's going on in China today is attributed to people like Hudson Taylor. But when Taylor was a young man, he was trying to figure out, how do I trust God? How can I trust him for daily provision? And he wasn't testing God, but he was testing himself. He was thinking, if I can't trust God here in the UK, when I'm surrounded by people who speak my language, how on earth am I going to be able to trust him when I go off to China? So he would do all these things that would put himself in a position where he would have to trust God. And there's one story that I love. He was walking along one evening in an area where previous to that he'd been giving out tracts, and tried to give a tract to this one particular guy who'd been super edgy with him, wasn't interested. And then this night, this same guy comes running up to Taylor and he says, look, will you come and see my wife? She's in a really bad state, she's really ill. Will you come and pray with her? And the priest won't come. At those days you had to pay the priest to come and visit. I can't afford the priest, will you come? And so Hudson Taylor went with this guy, and he said, I walked into his flat and it just stank. It was one of the most disgusting places I've been. He said there was 4 or 5 kids just looking just so unkept, just really kind of hollow, kind of withering away. He said there was a baby that was 36 hours old that was screaming, and there was this woman just looking absolutely just emaciated, lying on the mat. And the guy said, can you help us? Can you help us? And so Hudson said, I kind of knelt down and I began to pray, and I said to him, look, there's a Father who will provide for you. But as he said that, he remembered that he had in his pocket a half sovereign, a half crown coin, half sovereign. And that was worth the equivalent of, let's say, £50. It was like a £50 note in his pocket. And that was all the money he had. And as he was praying, he felt like God said to him, give that 50 quid to these guys. And immediately he said, no, this is all the money I've got, Lord. I can't give it to them. And then he began to think to himself, you hypocrite. You're telling these people to trust in a heavenly Father, but you can't trust him unless you've got 50 quid in your pocket. And he started to wish, oh my word, I wish it was broken down. It wasn't the coin, but I wish it was like 2 20s and a 10. And I'd give him 30 quid and I'd keep 20 quid for myself, because what am I going to eat tomorrow? And as he tried to pray again, he just felt this insistence. No, you've got to give it. So in the end, he took out this coin and he gave it to the guy, and he said to him, he looked him in the eyes and he said, you might think that it is a small thing for me to give you this coin, but I want you to know that this is all the money I have in the world, and there is a heavenly Father, and you can trust him, and he does love you. And he gave it to them. He said a prayer and he walked out. And he records in his journal that as he walked home from that encounter, his heart was as light as his pocket, and the streets resounded with the hymn that he sung of praise to God. And he said, I sat there that night with my little bowl of gruel, and I would not have exchanged it for a prince's feast. And then he said, before he went to bed, he knelt down by the side of his bed and he prayed a prayer, and he said, Lord, you say in your word that those who those who give to the poor lend to you. Well, I'm saying, can you make sure the loan's a short one, because I haven't got any money for tomorrow? And then he went to sleep that night. The next morning he woke up, and an envelope had arrived for him, and it had been smudged, the writing on the front, so he never found out who it was from. It had been smudged by the rain. And he opened up this envelope, and this big fat gold coin fell out, the equivalent of £200 today. And he writes in his journal that there was a 400% increase on the money that he gave to God. And as he records over his life, he saw loads of other challenges, but he says this when he's reflecting back. He says, I brought all to him, that's to God, in prayer. Thus, I experienced quite early how he is willing to help and strengthen to fulfill the desire of those who fear him. And so, in later years, when I prayed, the money came. He trained himself to pray for the very little things that he needed every single day. And not only did God provide for him, I mean, he had a hard life. It's not to say he never had issues. His wife, his first wife, died. 3 of his kids died. He had incredible challenges out there in China. But there was this closeness because he understood that God gives us our daily bread when we ask him. And he understood that in coming to him for that, a bond is formed between our heart and God's. We have intimacy. And it's so easy, or maybe this is just me, isn't it so easy to drift away from God? There was a time just about a year ago when this happened to me, and it wasn't that it happened in one-off occasion, it was just a gradual thing that I found myself drifting away from the one who is daily bread, the one who is the bread of life. And in practice, what it sounds like a super spiritual thing, but let me give you some examples of what it looked like in practice. I wrote them down. It meant that when I got up to speak, I had nothing to say. I was getting up speaking places and I was just scraping the barrel for anything to bring. It meant that I became quick to take offense and I was very quick to judge other people. It meant that I became hard-hearted and cynical. And my story's always been one where God softened my heart. When I came to know him, that's what happened. And I found myself just becoming increasingly jaded and cynical. And another thing that it meant is, I don't like admitting this, but I became really envious of people. And that's never been for me a big challenge. I don't think I've ever really coveted people's possessions, but I found myself sometimes driving behind someone in a nice car and just thinking, wow, look at that car. I'd love to have a car like that. Or look at that person's house. I'll never have a house like that. And I became envious. Envy had grown like a weed in me. I was stressed all the time. I could never relax and just trust that God was in charge. I was super stressed all the time. When I went to church, I didn't want to be there. I found it really hard, which was unfortunate because I'm one of the pastors of the church. And it wasn't my church, it was me, it was what was going on in me. And I didn't see it. This is the thing. For so long, I was living like that and I didn't realize it. And the time it really hit me was actually weirdly, it was when I was giving a talk. And I was saying, look, one of the most important things we can do as Christians is draw near to Jesus daily, come close to him. And as I was speaking, I told them, do you know what I used to do? When I was a student, I used to go and find this little bit of kind of countryside where there's a river and stuff. And I used to go there really early in the morning, which if you're a student is 10:30. And it was actually a bit earlier than that. I'd go out and I would just sing. And I sound horrific. Like I'm pretty sure some birds died. I'm pretty sure that when I said, God, I want to sing to you, God was up in heaven going, no. But anyway, I would go out there and I would sing to the Lord and I would read my Bible and I would just be there. And as I was saying this, even in the talk, I was thinking to myself, gosh, when was the last time I ever did anything like that? When was the last time I was ever close to you? And God began to speak to me in way after way after way through person and talk that I heard and things that I watched. It was like, I've fallen away from you. I've forsaken my first love. And what I've compared it to now is, it's a little bit like drinking whiskey. I don't know if you ever drank a glass of whiskey, but if you drink a little bit of whiskey, it feels like as you're drinking it, it feels like you're warming up. You have this warm sensation that goes through your body. But what's actually happening, the science behind it, is your blood vessels are coming to the surface and they're dilating. And so your body's actually losing heat. You feel like you're warming up, but you are in fact cooling down. And so often, when we think we're becoming mature Christians, I'm becoming independent, an independent Christian. It's like I'm not needing him as much as maybe I used to. We think we're warming up. Look how busy I am. Look at all the stuff that I'm doing for God. Look at all these things I'm doing for him. But we're not being near him. And so although we feel like we're warming up, what is in fact happening is we are cooling down. We cannot survive without being near him every single day. This prayer that seems to be so ordinary, give us today our daily bread, is the key to an unbelievable life of intimacy with him. Learning to trust that he's a father who provides for his kids. The same trip that I told you about when I went to India, I was on a train and I left the place I'd been there for a month. I left the school where I was working and I was traveling back to Delhi on this train. It was a long train ride, it was about 6 hours, and I had no food. And I remember as I sat in this carriage, I've always had something of a sense in those moments that there's an intimacy with God. I don't know why, because I suppose you're not depending on other things in those places. And I just knew he was there, and I sat there reading my Bible. And it got to about lunchtime, and there was only one other person in this carriage. It was this bloke, and this Indian guy got up and he walked over to where I was, and he took his lunch. He had this kind of Indian bread, and he broke it in half, and he offered it to me. And I took it, and he went and sat back down, and the two of us sat there in silence. He sat over there eating his bread, and I sat over here eating his bread. And in that moment, it wasn't like, it was his kindness, first of all, but in that moment there was something more than just bread that was going on. When I look back at that story, and it was years ago now, I still remember it. It was such a simple thing, but it was like, there I was on a train in the middle of a country where I knew nobody, with no lunch, and I would have been okay, but you just seized the opportunity to give me something, just your way of saying, I'll provide your daily bread because, and this is the key, I am the bread of life. It's not really about bread at all. I am your sustenance. If you are hungry, I will satisfy you. If you are thirsty, you can draw near to me, and that thirst will be quenched. The good news is this: God doesn't want you to trust him for your entire life right now. He doesn't want you to trust him for a year right now, or for a month, or for a week. He just wants you to trust him for a single day. And then he wants you to do the same thing tomorrow. And as we do that day after day after day, an unbelievable bond is formed between our heart and his. Thanks so much for watching. This is God Speaks Today. I'll see you next time.